I'm Amanda Lynch. I'm a counsellor with the AIIA ACT branch, and it's a real delight to have Sarah here tonight to discuss the presentation of global priorities and accelerating gender equality, including by means of UN resolutions, treaties and platforms. Sarah's involved in UN Women, and she's the non-executive director for UN Women Australia, has a background with DFAT and the former AusAid in a range of roles, including in the Fragile States Unit and Multilaterals Effectiveness Section. She was posted to Solomon Islands, working on the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, Ramsey. And Sarah's very passionate about gender equality, has had over 20 years experience in international cultural exchanges, education and development in a range of organisations. She's lived and worked in Fiji, France, Solomon Islands, United Kingdom and Vanuatu. And this talk will very much focus on the gender gap and its impact on poverty. And one of the major causes of poverty and hunger is gender inequality. It's a very interesting topic, and we are just so delighted to welcome Sarah to this virtual event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for this opportunity to give a presentation tonight to your members on behalf of UN Women Australia. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I work, the Wadi Wadi people of the Dharawal Nation here in Wollongong, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as you've mentioned, Amanda, the topic that I'm talking about today is, do UN resolutions progress gender equality at the national level? I'd like to, I guess, firstly acknowledge that there's probably a lot of expertise within your membership and potentially joining us tonight. So I'm speaking very much from the perspective of being a practitioner. So as you've noted in the introduction, I've worked in gender equality and predominantly in the Pacific. So my perspective is very much from what that means, rather than potentially people who may have expertise in constructing UN resolutions and negotiating them at headquarters. So I just wanted to get that perspective out there. So I'm hoping to start with a video, assuming the technology works, just to sort of set the scene. And this video is a campaign that UN Women Australia launched on International Women's Day this year. So I will share that now, and hopefully that works.
Here in Australia, we're pretty easygoing. We don't like to get caught up in things. If something goes wrong, we just say, she'll be right. If we lose a ball over the back fence, she'll be right. The car's parked it in the middle of the bush, she'll be right. She's still being paid 87 cents to the dollar, she'll be right. She can't walk home alone at night for fear of being raped, she'll be right. You see, for a country that's ranked 44th on the Global Gender Gap Index, she's just not that big of a priority. I mean, she's only boss 18% of the time. She'll be right. She has a 1 in 3 chance of being assaulted. She'll be right. She could even be the one woman a week killed by a man she knew and trusted. But yeah, she'll be right. When will she be right? Dunno. You see, Aussies don't usually talk about when. She will be. Eventually. Right?
So somewhat depressingly, since we launched that campaign in March this year, the latest Global Gender Gap Report has been launched, and it's actually now estimated that it will take 135 years to close the gender gap worldwide. And according to the latest data, women hold only 26% of over 35,000 parliamentary seats. And there are 81 countries that have still never had a woman as their head of state. There is some progress in women being increasingly amongst skilled professionals, and we are making slow progress towards gender equality. But women still represent only 27% of all manager positions. Unfortunately, gender gaps in labour force participation have widened quite significantly as a result of the pandemic. 5% of women have lost their jobs compared to 3% for men. And we also know that even women who haven't lost their jobs have had to step back from their jobs to manage the increasing workload around homeschooling. Also, prior to the pandemic, the global rate of women experiencing physical or sexual violence by a partner was 1 in 3. And again, emerging data shows that calls to domestic helplines in most countries have significantly increased since COVID-19. And the UN calls this the shadow pandemic. The one positive area, I guess, the most positive area is in closing the gap in educational attainment, where 95% of countries have closed the gap, and it's looking at only 14 years to fully close for the remainder. And 56 countries have achieved full gender parity in health outcomes. So as a region, out of the 8 regions covered by the study, the Asia Pacific ranks 5th. And Australia is currently ranked in the latest report 50th out of 156 countries, and has actually been sliding in the rankings each year. So in 2006, Australia was in fact ranked 15th. So I think what's important to note is that no country in the world has achieved gender equality, not even the Scandinavians that are often held up as sort of being the model for gender equality. And I think as an issue, I think what we're seeing globally is that there's increasing dissatisfaction with this slow progress. I mean, 135 years for boys and girls to be expecting to have equal opportunity is just far too long. We've seen the Me Too movements, and of course in Australia, we've seen national protests. So the topic today is, you know, how do UN resolutions actually have an impact on that at all? And when I first joined the Australian government, one of my first jobs was in what was then called, I think it was the UN and Africa section. And this was my first introduction to UN resolutions. And there was a vigorous debate amongst the team about whether Australia would accept the words affirming that or acknowledging that. And I do recall at the time thinking, if that's going to make any difference to anybody's life, how is that going to alleviate poverty? But I guess as a bit of a spoiler alert, my position on that has somewhat shifted through sort of more extensive engagement, working both in gender equality and with and around the UN. So I thought a useful starting point would be just to map out what are the main UN resolutions and conventions on gender equality. There actually are quite a lot, but what I thought would be just to give a brief chronological sort of list of the main resolutions and conventions. So in 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is commonly referred to as CEDAW, was adopted at the UN General Assembly. It's pretty much considered the Bill of Rights for women, and it took about 30 years to actually get that convention drafted and adopted, but it really got the ball rolling in terms of global frameworks and on gender equality. It remains to this day, I would say, probably the most central and comprehensive of all the declarations and conventions on the advancement for women. And it has 16 articles that set out rights across a range of areas for women, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural fields. Now, 189 countries have ratified CEDAW, and by doing so, the member states are then legally bound to put provisions in practice to address the articles, and they're also required to submit national reports at least every 4 years, although in practice that ends up sometimes stretching out to a bit longer than that. So the reports are submitted to what's called the CEDAW committee, which is comprised of 23 independent elected members. So in the beginning of this year, Natasha Stott-Despoja was elected to the CEDAW committee. And that's in fact the first time Australia has had a representative on the committee in 30 years, although they're not representing their governments or their countries, they're there in a capacity of their expertise on gender equality. So there's also with CEDAW, there's an optional protocol, and that's actually what that optional protocol does is establish there's a complaints mechanism whereby the committee can hear complaints by individuals and in some cases investigate what is considered systematic violations of the convention. Although there's been limited use of that, I guess would be the general sort of view. So moving forward, leaping forward a little bit to 1993, and we have the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. So all the subsequent declarations and frameworks, I think, really build from that foundation that CEDAW laid out, and they get more specific and explicit in particular sort of areas. So obviously, violence against women is a very prevalent and persistent issue, and it really does affect every aspect of women's opportunities. And it is unfortunately persistently stubborn in sort of trying to address that as an issue. So this declaration includes articles that encourage member states to develop penal, civil, labour and administrative sanctions in their domestic legislation and encourages them to consider developing national plans of action and importantly, promoting data collection and statistics, because if you don't know the extent of the problem, it's very hard, of course, to address it. So in 1995, there was the 4th World Conference of Women, which was held in Beijing, China. And it was at this conference that the Beijing Platform for Action was developed. So most people working in gender equality would sort of consider that CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action are some of the 2 most significant sort of normative global frameworks. So what the Beijing Platform for Action is it's essentially referred to as the blueprint. So how do you remove these systemic barriers that hold women back from equal participation? So the Beijing Platform for Action has 12 critical areas of concern, and it covers a wide range of issues such as poverty, health, armed conflict, power and decision-making, violence, and also issues particularly relating to the girl child. So again, there's progress against this is measured and reported on every 5 years. And this can be through national and sometimes regional reports that identify progress and priorities for the coming 5 years. So moving forward again to the year 2000, and we began to see the emergence of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So there's actually between 2000 and 2019, there are 10 UN resolutions that have been adopted. The first and probably one of the most well-known is referred to as 1325. And this is the resolution on the participation of women and the inclusion of gender perspectives in peace negotiations, humanitarian planning and peacekeeping. Now, over those 10 resolutions, there's essentially 4 pillars relating to women, peace and security. These are around prevention, participation, protection, and peace building and recovery. So that same year, that's when we had the Millennium Development Goals. So there were 8 goals, and including the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment. So again, we've now got the Sustainable Development Goals, which took effect in 2016, and they've gone from 8 to 17 goals. And the language around gender equality has also changed to be achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women rather than just the promotion. So underneath, that's SDG 5 is on gender equality. So underneath that, there are 9 targets for countries to meet. And they're again across a range of areas, including ending discrimination, eliminating violence, early marriage, and ensuring the full participation in leadership. And also very importantly, what a quite, contentious issue in many countries is universal access to sexual and reproductive health. Now, what these resolutions do is essentially set global standards, and they elicit commitments from member states. But I think it's important to always reflect on these, that they're only effective if they are adopted, but also if they're monitored. Otherwise, they remain a commitment that doesn't really have any follow through. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how these resolutions are monitored within the UN system. So the main Commission on the Status of Women is essentially the principal intergovernmental body, and it's exclusively dedicated to the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women. So it was established in 1946, so it's been running for quite some time now. And in fact, it's the Commission that drafted most of the key UN resolutions on gender equality, including CEDAW, and it also established the first World Conference on Women in 1975. So after the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action, they actually expanded the mandate of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW. I'll just abbreviate it because that's what it's quicker to say, and that's how it's commonly referred to. And so now they review progress in the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. So each year, CSW has a 2-week session, and this is really the big deal on the sort of global calendar for gender equality. It's the largest gathering on women's rights worldwide, and you have thousands of representatives from UN member states, UN agencies, and importantly, civil society. And the purpose of the meeting is to discuss progress and gaps in implementing the Beijing Platform for Action, and also discuss other emerging issues. So each CSW session has a theme. So this year, again, it was virtual thanks to COVID. The theme was Women in Public Life, Equal Participation in Decision Making. And next year, the topic is Achieving Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment in the Context of Climate Change, which I think is a very interesting topic because there are lots of intersections between gender equality and climate change and how they impact on each other. So at the end of this 2-week gathering, their sort of main output is they have the agreed conclusions document. And so what that document does is contains analysis on the theme for that year, and also has a set of concrete recommendations that governments, human rights institutions, civil society, the private sector, really all relevant stakeholders then seek to implement at the international, national, and regional level. So within the UN system, UN Women is the organisation that is, of course, responsible for gender equality and the empowerment of women. Now, many of you would be familiar that UN Women is, in fact, quite a newly established agency. So it was created in 2010, and it brought together there were a number of agencies that used to work on gender equality and empowerment of women. Most people would have heard, of course, of the main predecessor, which is UNIFEM. So UN Women within the UN system is slightly unusual in that it has what's called the triple mandate. So that means it has 3 primary functions that it performs. The first one is, in fact, supporting the intergovernmental bodies such as the Commission on the Status of Women in the formulation of policies, global standards and norms. So this is the normative function of UN Women. The second important function of UN Women is it actually helps member states to implement these standards. And this is through technical advice and financial support, working both with governments and civil society and other actors. So it's a really important role that not only do they sort of, I guess, work to govern and formulate those global frameworks and normative standards, but then actually to help member states to implement them. And the third function of UN Women is it actually leads and coordinates within the UN system their work on gender equality. So in some ways, I guess UN Women is the gender advisor to the UN system more broadly. So this operates at the country level as well. So what you would see in what's called the UN country teams is that UN Women will always be the organisation that is, I guess, tasked with ensuring that gender equality is mainstreamed through all of UN's work in country. And they actually have what's called the UN country team gender scorecard, which is essentially a standardized assessment of gender mainstreaming, which is implemented at the country level. So that's a sort of broad brush, sort of quick snapshot of what the UN architecture and the global frameworks are. But I guess what's really to get to the heart of the question is, what difference does any of this make to, say, a woman in a village in Pentecost in Vanuatu? So I think it's important to reflect a little bit on some of the Pacific shares some common challenges in achieving gender equality, like every country in the world, but they also have both some unique challenges and a few unique opportunities as well. So the Pacific, unfortunately, has the lowest rate of women's political representation in the world. They also, unfortunately, the global average for experience of gender-based violence is 1 in 3 women, and unfortunately in the Pacific it's actually 2 in 3. So there are 7 countries in the world that haven't ratified CEDAW, and 2 of them are in the Pacific. The other challenge faced by the Pacific in progressing gender equality is small countries, small populations, small governments with limited resources, and the ministries of women or office of women or whatever the configuration is are often really small in the Pacific, and they have few resources, but they're still tackling really complex issues. Just because you only have two staff in the team, that doesn't mean that addressing gender-based violence is any easier. So it's an even bigger challenge for these small teams. But they do have, I think, which is a real strength and positive, is the Pacific has a really active and well-connected national and regional women's movement. And they've been instrumental in many of the developments that we see in gender equality in the region. And there also is supportive regional organizations such as the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat and the Pacific Community, as well as frameworks and declarations at the regional level. So there is a Pacific Platform for Action, which interestingly was actually developed before the Beijing Platform for Action. There was a meeting in the lead up, sort of Pacific regional preparatory meeting, where they decided to put forward their collective views of what was important, and that was the Pacific Platform of Action, which actually very closely aligned with what came out in the Beijing Platform for Action. And so the Pacific Platform for Action has been updated throughout the years and still remains a really important regional framework. And there's also the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, which was adopted in 2012. So that's a little bit of context on the situation for gender equality. Now, to link it back to the question, there are actually a few examples, very specific examples, where CEDAW and the ratification of CEDAW by governments has actually provided an opportunity to progress gender equality. So in Fiji, there are a few cases where sort of women's human rights groups pushed for amendment for equal citizenship rights and tougher sentences on rape and violence cases. And that was using the ratification of CEDAW by the government of Fiji as the basis for that. In Vanuatu, there was also, it was used in the courts to give Ni Vanuatu women rights to customary land. It was also used in Kiribati by a prosecutor to argue against an unfavourable rule for women in rape cases. Unfortunately, that was not successful, is my understanding, but it did sort of open the door to say, once you ratify these conventions, you have agreed to these standards, and they can be used in many ways. So I think just to talk about what I think in the 3 main ways in which UN resolutions can support gender equality at the national level. The first would be is it sets the standards. So those global frameworks and standards clearly map out what are the key areas of concern and what governments should be doing if they want to achieve gender equality. So these then get translated, these global commitments translate into national policy and legislation. So in the Pacific, I've just recently, for a report I'm writing, read every national gender policy from the Pacific. And whilst they vary, obviously, depending on the context and the particular issues and challenges and opportunities, there is a degree of consistency, and you can see those global standards reflected in these national gender policies in terms of the priorities. There's usually consistently priorities around women's leadership, around ending violence against women, and also women's economic empowerment are three quite common themes that you'll see. Other great progress in the Pacific you will see is the implementation of domestic violence or family protection legislation. This has been a huge development in the region over a number of years, and really puts in place those legal protections for women and children. The second main way that I think UN resolutions can support gender equality is they support accountability and reflection. So by ratifying CEDAW and being part of adopting the Beijing Platform for Action triggers those reporting requirements. Now, those reporting requirements, I guess, provide an opportunity for periodic review and reflection. So looking at domestic laws, policies, and practices. And in a lot of cases, for example, I know in Fiji, they do national consultations. So it really creates that forum and that space for different groups, so the government, civil society, and other parts of government to reflect on what has been achieved and what remains to be done. And of course, by reporting to the CEDAW committee or presenting your report at CSW, you are actually creating a role for NGOs and civil societies to actually hold governments accountable, so they can advocate and lobby to governments to say, you signed up to this commitment, yet this legislation still discriminates against women. And within the CEDAW reporting in particular, NGOs can prepare what's called a shadow report. So whilst some governments are self-critical and very honest about what progress there is and what remains to be done, there's still that opportunity there for civil society to sort of either encourage and support the government's assessment or identify where they think there are gaps. So the third and I guess final point, which I think is very interesting for women's movements globally, but I think is particularly important in the Pacific, is it provides a platform for collective action. So as I noted earlier, the women's machinery, and I guess particularly on the government side, is very small in a lot of these countries, and these are quite challenging social norms changes and quite challenging issues they're trying to address. So the ability to work across countries and develop those regional connections and frameworks is actually really beneficial to progressing gender equality. So forums such as CSW is a great opportunity for women from across these countries to get together. And I think the Pacific does this particularly well in gender equality. And I think the other area where we see the Pacific really come together as a region and have a voice on the global stage is, of course, around climate change. So UN Women a couple of years ago, in fact, supported the Pacific Ministers for Women to come together ahead of CSW preparatory meetings to really give them a chance to formulate their ideas of what were the main issues that the Pacific wanted to present. And then that was then contributed to the Asia Pacific preparatory meeting, where they felt they had a very clear and cohesive position as a region. So to go back to the woman who's in Pentecost, Vanuatu, and consider what the existence of these global norms and standards means, I think, what we can say is that, should she or somebody in her family experience gender-based violence, well, there's legal protections that are in place that protect her. There's coordinated services. So we have the coordination between health service providers, crisis services, police, and the judiciary. She's likely to see more women running for leadership positions, even if they perhaps aren't yet achieving national parliamentary positions. There's probably still women in local level government positions, and that visibility of women as leaders sort of creates the idea that it is possible and women should be in those places. She's also probably got an increased opportunity to earn an income and, importantly, own assets, including land, which in the Pacific is obviously a particularly challenging and contentious area for women. And hopefully she can make more decisions about how she spends that income. So I guess in conclusion, I think my final response to my own question is that what we're really seeing, I think COVID in particular has really shone the light and exacerbated in many ways existing inequalities. So we're really in a time of sort of both great momentum, but also upheaval. So these global norms and standards on gender equality, and most importantly, these mechanisms that continue to shine the light on gender equality and keep it in the attention and hold member states accountable for their achievement are more critical than ever. Now, UN resolutions alone are not going to achieve gender equality, but I do think they play a critical role in developing international standards and then supporting local action. And so alongside government, civil society, private sector, and of course, individuals, I think together, I think they can actually support gender equality. So I'm going to finish up there. That was a lot of information and talking, and of course, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's just amazing the work that is taking place around the world. So it's really inspiring. And I just wanted to kick off the questions, and please send them through. I see Heath has put one in, which is great. My question is really about some of the nations that don't sign up to the treaties. Are they risking being pariahs? Is there pressure from their peers to actually sign these agreements?
Yeah, look, I think that, that's really fundamentally how diplomacy works, isn't it? There's, a standard that's set, and part of that is, encouraging by your peers. And, to give an example, the United States has not ratified CEDAW. So, that's it's quite a significant country to have not ratified such an important convention. And, there's always those attempts to bring everybody in, because the point of the UN is its agenda and its conventions actually reflect the membership. So, if 189 members sign up to this and 3 don't, then you can expect that those are, peer pressure, schoolyard peer pressure on a global stage. So that is the idea. Yes.
Thank you. And the question that Heath has asked is, the multilateral development banks provide leverage through their women in development programs for actions to support women's economic participation in developing countries. Can you say something about UN Women's links with the MDBs, especially in the Pacific? Many thanks.
Sure. So my current role actually is with the Asian Development Bank. So I work as the Economic Empowerment of Women Specialist on the Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative. So I've gone from UN Women to a multilateral development bank. And thank you for the question, Heath, because it has been interesting working in a multilateral development bank, because I do think they play a really important role in the loans that they make to countries, include in many cases requirements for specific gender equality actions. I'm working on something in PNG along those lines at the moment. And I think that UN Women, with the role they play on providing that technical support, they actually are one of the key stakeholders that help. So, the multilateral development banks, I think, as you know, provide the leverage, give the little push, and then UN Women can in fact help governments to meet those standards and achieve those gender equality things. So I think it works very nicely together, because you've got, I guess, the carrot and the stick there, because you obviously want to be able to not just set really high standards, but you obviously also want to help these governments to genuinely be able to make that progress and achieve gender equality.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Dr. Rothschild. How does UNIFEM's new group assist in supporting women in Afghanistan who undertook police officer training, were sworn in, but are currently not able to work? Thank you.
Well, that's a very specific question, I guess, about UN Women's work in Afghanistan. If I'm understanding the question, sorry, I'm just going to look at it. So to be honest, I can't answer on behalf of what UN Women is doing in Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, I think, you know, like everybody, I've watched, I guess, in horror at how quickly the situation has changed there and the situation of women. I know that UN Women is incredibly focused on continuing to support gender equality, and I'm sure those specific initiatives that have been undertaken there are looking at ways and how they can obviously immediately protect lives, I think, is the current focus. But of course, I think then looking a little down the track about how they can continue some of those initiatives, such as getting more women in key areas like the police force, which I think are absolutely critical.
And what do you think the main barriers to equality are at the moment? I mean, I'd say access to education would be a big one. What do you think at that real grassroots level that the barriers to preventing equality for women in the Pacific and even broader than that, Sarah?
Oh, well, that's a complex issue and question. In fact, educational attainment, there's actually quite good, almost parity, I think, in most Pacific Island countries in terms of enrollment in school between boys and girls. What you do see, though, is it's later as they get down the track. So they may have equal opportunity to attend primary school. You might start to see the dropout occur potentially at high school because there are different roles assigned to girls and boys in the Pacific, as there are in many countries. But some of the cultural traditions, I think, and just the requirements are that if you can only afford school fees for, you know, 1 or 2 children, then you're more likely to prioritize boys over girls education. But I think then these issues start to compound once you get into women, obviously in their childbearing years, where they, you know, careers become a choice between careers and having a family, that in most cases the expectation is that the woman will become a mother and she will be the primary caregiver. And those sort of expectations are very hard to shrug off in countries, particularly, I guess, where there are quite clear expectations about the priority of family in these communities. I think also there's still deep-seated discrimination and bias against women taking on jobs at senior levels. I'm doing a report at the moment about women's leadership in the business sector, which in the Pacific is actually better than in the political sphere, but still the expectation is that women aren't the boss. You know, women don't work in male-dominated fields in the Pacific is particularly challenging. And of course, you know, underpinning all of this is the experience of gender-based violence, the idea that women are property and that women, and it's not just men that hold the view that it is okay under some circumstances to hit your wife. That's actually a view that is held by men and women in a lot of these countries. So breaking through those kinds of sort of social norms and expectations on the roles of men and women are really difficult in any context, but I think they're very deeply entrenched in some Pacific communities.
Yeah, speaking of that, I saw a survey that said 1 in 3 women in Afghanistan thought women were too emotional for leadership. So there's an issue in terms of the cultural expectations by women as well as by men, which makes it complex, really.
Yeah, and that's that conditioning, isn't it? That you know, if that's what there's taught and that is what the general view is, then women internalize that and believe it as well.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of questions here. There's a question about Julie Gillard's role in the UN and what she's participating in. I see she's involved in some of the mental health and men's charities as well. So what's her particular role in the UN Women?
So I'm not aware of her having a role specifically in UN Women. I mean, obviously she's a very strong advocate for gender equality, both nationally and internationally. I mean, she was previously the chair of the Global Education Fund, which is a UN agency. And so obviously she was very focused on the issue that you mentioned, Amanda, earlier about getting girls into education as a really critical first step. So she's certainly always been a strong advocate. And I think we've seen that recently in Australia in some some of the sort of documentaries and series that have come out, and she's of course now involved in the Women's Leadership Initiative that is just sort of associated with King's College in the UK. So she's definitely very active. I'm not aware that she has a specific role with UN Women, but I'm sure she would consider herself an advocate in general for gender equality, including the work undertaken by UN Women.
So there's one here about, do you see some movement in the US position on CEDAW now that their vice president is a woman?
Well, I mean, you live in hope, don't you? But I think I read recently that there's been perhaps 6 or 7 attempts to get the US to ratify CEDAW. So there is a consistent and constant push, I think, to get CEDAW to be ratified by the US. And let's hope, I genuinely hope that having a woman in such an important leadership position is actually perhaps what it requires to tip that in the right direction.
Question from Sandra Bernclough. Thanks, Sarah. Excellent presentation. For national women's organisations, having UN resolutions to hold up as a framework and standard is very powerful. We've seen UN resolutions used for advocacy and lobbying in the Pacific, and as you said, lead to legislative and policy change, such as developing legislation to address VAWG. One of the frustrations, of course, is the development sector is getting sufficient support to national women's organisations. What do you see as the key barriers to supporting national women's organisations, especially for international development partners, as often this is perceived as Western influence from outside to progress gender equality?
Thank you, Sandra, for the question. So I will just, Sandra Bernclough is in fact the representative for UN Women in Fiji. So she'd probably be better placed even than me to answer that question. So she's my former boss, but it is a particularly challenging in the Pacific because, and I'm sure in other countries around the world, that gender equality is considered as well a Western concept that is, you know, in many ways being forced on these countries, that's in contrast to their culture and traditions. But, you know, I mean, I think international development partners, if they want to genuinely support governments and the commitment to gender equality, then they really do need to be able to channel funds to these organizations, because at the end of the day, it's that local ownership and those local movements that are really critical to making change, you know, because as international development actors, priorities actually can change over time. You know, if you work for a bilateral government, the government changes and you might sort of, you know, change what your priorities are and where your funding goes. But I do think that that's absolutely at the essence of funding those organizations that are there all the time, got all the background and the experience, and it's not easy to do. I think bureaucratic processes sometimes make that particularly challenging, as Sandra would well know, but nonetheless an absolutely critical aspect of progressing gender equality.
Yes, that's a good question, and it's good to have part of the audience from overseas as well, including Fiji. So thanks for joining us. And Kate asks, in your view, and this is a good segue for the last question, in your view, are donors ambitious enough in their gender-related aid programs in the Pacific? Do you see a focus on participation rather than meaningful change, or is it simply a long road to travel?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely a long road to travel. I mean, you know, anyone who works in gender equality, you know, you'll hear that constantly this is about generational change, you know, changing the minds of this sort of merging young people coming up now. Look, I have to give full credit to the Australian government, because I do think that for a very long period of time now, they have been clearly committed to gender equality. And in the Pacific in particular, they had the Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development Program, which was $320 million over 10 years and was actually quite successfully, I guess, ring-fenced against some of the cuts that the aid budget has seen. So I think there are definitely some donors that have been consistent on that. I think there's probably still space within development partners and donors to consider what more they could be doing. I mean, I have conversations like this all the time at work about, that's great, we do that, but, if we're not helping to push this agenda and support this agenda, then that's why it's taking 135 years to get there. So yeah, I think they absolutely, I will always advocate that they could be more ambitious, but I do recognize there are competing priorities, even though for me, gender equality would be number one.
Yeah. Thank you. And Robin Sampson asked a question, are you aware of women at risk in the Pacific in the context of migration? I'm wondering about trafficking, but also forced migration due to degradation of traditional lands.
Yeah, look, this is not an area of my expertise, but it definitely is an issue that I have heard come up from time to time in a few different contexts. There are some countries where you do see the women that have been brought in, migrant workers, I think in particular countries in the Pacific. And I think Palau would be one of the countries that the North Pacific obviously has closer proximity to parts of Asia. And I do think there is probably, the issue is not well understood in the Pacific, but I think it would be probably naive to say that there weren't issues associated with the sort of migrant, not just migrant women, but obviously women within these communities in terms of, even early marriage is, a form of, sort of putting women at risk and forcing them to move to other communities. And of course, the whole issue I think Robin's referring to there about climate change and people moving within countries from traditional communities to other locations, and what that does in terms of the upheaval that presents to, I guess, traditional social structures and communities. So I think, yeah, I think it's an issue that isn't well understood. There's not a lot of data on, but absolutely is an issue in the Pacific.
Thank you. So Amelia Young, thank you, Sarah, for a really great overview of UN resolutions pertaining to gender equality. Do you have any thoughts or insights on how UN resolutions have affected our domestic experience here in Australia? What are your thoughts on our latest Australia's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security?
Sure, thank you, Amelia. So again, I will say I have only returned to Australia in recently, so I think for me, I've been very focused on the Pacific and continue to work there. But I am aware that there's been quite a significant investment by the Australian government in developing the national action plans, I think, and reviewing the previous action plans. So I think, Australia, like any country has, that has ratified CEDAW, is obligated to report in the same way. Obviously, we have very strong civil society and women's rights groups that advocate and lobby for Australian government to do better. So I mean, I can't comment specifically on the Australia's National Action Plan. I do think we've obviously seen recently that the Australian government has responded to the voice of the people and sort of saying, we think women's security is a big issue that has not been addressed. So obviously we've had the Women's Safety Summit as well come up recently. So I think the Australian government, I think it would be remiss to say that there isn't more the Australian government could do when their ranking has slipped, I think. But part of that could be that obviously other countries have progressed at a faster rate. But it is cause for concern to go from ranked as 15th in the Global Gender Gap Index to 50th. And it does suggest that got to double down, I think, on those efforts. And I think women, peace and security is one of the many areas that Australian governments will be focused on to sort of progress gender equality.
So we've got a question from Robin, another question from Robin. Given the cultural dimension mentioned, what role did churches play in progressing and or hindering women's progress towards equality?
Oh, Robin, excellent question. So in the Pacific, the churches actually are playing an increasingly critical role in being powerful advocates for gender equality. So UN Women in the Pacific has been working closely with churches, particularly on the issue of gender-based violence. So what we see in Fiji, for example, is a multi-faith sort of, obviously Fiji is quite a diverse country, and they have multi-faith campaigns where the churches are actually getting behind the issue, because in the Pacific, they are particularly influential. I mean, most people in the Pacific would, be involved in a church and be quite religious. So the role that they play in the Pacific, I would say, in terms of progressing this agenda. But by the same token, I think, Robin, you're obviously understanding that also some of the, I guess, traditional views expressed in the Bible and the interpretations of them do state specific roles for men and women, which can in fact erode progress. But I would say in the Pacific, the churches are actually being active and powerful advocates for gender equality.
Yeah, we've got a very well-informed audience here. It's fantastic questions. And Yolanda Vega. Hi, Sarah. Considering the power of CEDAW, how can women advocate for faster ratification of domestic policies?
Well, I think women have been doing, I think we've seen in Australia this year that I think women are doing a fantastic job of advocating for change and support. So, I think it's part of the challenge, I think, is some of the ratification of CEDAW and some of the articles can be quite complex and obviously very focused on legislation. Now, I don't know that many people that are that familiar with legislation in Australia, but that's why there are particular women's groups that, organizations that focus on specific areas. So there's obviously dedicated on, gender-based violence, women's economic empowerment. And I think that there's opportunities to get involved with those existing groups and movements, and this might be working for those. It might be, supporting petitions, I think, are a powerful one. But I think for me, one of the important things is always that we need to, sorry, that's one of my children. We need to understand that we actually have a really important role as individuals in how we shape and model behavior. So I think that's one that we often overlook, is the power we have as individuals to stand up for our rights, to call out bad behavior, and especially when you have any kind of interaction with people in decision-making positions. So I think there's, opportunities to get involved in movements, opportunities to work with organizations, but also that role we have as individuals.
Yeah. And are there any examples of really tangible outcomes that have resulted from some of the work that's been done in the Pacific on women? I remember seeing something about Papua New Guinea market holders and how they were risking assault and rape just by having a stall at the markets. And the solution was really quite simple, to actually have protection and guards taking them to and from their stalls and just patrolling the markets at night. So just wondering if there are any other tangible examples of people's lives improving.
Look, I think UN Women has done some really fantastic work in the Pacific, and that example that you cited there is also in other parts of the Pacific. So the Markets for Change program, which operates in Fiji, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. What I love about this program is it sort of works with a group and market vendors. And, market vendors are really, that's a common role that women have. They really are the backbone in many cases of the Pacific. And UN Women has worked with them to help them to have safer markets, cleaner markets. So they've actually done some infrastructure work to address some of those issues about, safe, clean toilets. Often women would sleep in the markets under their tables at night with their children, built accommodation. But I think some of the important aspects is they've helped them form market vendor associations. So these women now have a collective, and they advocate as a collective to market management to say, we want this to be safer, and we want the police to come here and patrol. And they've actually, as a group, really been able to influence their own lives and actually achieve change just with a little bit of support to help them get together. And, then you see women who take on these leadership roles at the market vendor associations go on to other roles. So I think it's, and also obviously making it easier and safer for them to earn an income. and work with them on, being able to have access to bank accounts, really things that in many ways seem basic, but are absolutely critical to having women who are, sort of more prosperous and able to have more options in life, which is really what gender equality is all about.
It's great to hear some positive stories. I think we need those at the moment.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got another question from Dr. Rothschilds. What would you like to see the Pacific-based media do better to promote the UN women's cause?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because the media obviously plays a really critical role. And so there was actually a recent case in Fiji where there was some reporting against the former Minister for Women, which was really, quite scandalous, and it was essentially defamation. So I think the media has a role in how they shape the agenda, how they report on issues, what language they use. I think that's really critical in the first instance about shaping, the social norms and helping shift some of that thinking. And I think, that's not exclusive to the Pacific. We see that here in Australia as well, the way in which, gender bias and gender norms can influence media reporting. But I think it's also, taking up the issue, like choosing to report on those particular issues and highlighting them. I think there's some good examples, I think, in Fiji, where they really do report more on the instance of gender-based violence, because it's such a prevalent issue, and people have for a long time said it's a family issue, it stays in the home, you don't talk about it. So I think that's a really good example of where the media can say, no, this is not a family issue, this shouldn't be ignored, this is front and center, this is something that everybody in this country, government, communities, church groups need to actually understand is an issue that's affecting families and communities and women, and address it. So I think the media can play a really critical role in progressing those agendas.
Mm-hmm. That's important. So we've got another question from S. What practical efforts can be made to enable greater Indigenous women participating at meetings that shape government policies and programs?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue, because I think when people talk about gender equality and women's participation, I think there's this idea that, women are a homogenous group, which is of course not true. Women come from every kind of background and have every kind of experience. So if you really want true diversity and you really want to bring in all those perspectives, you have to actively understand that. Now, I think part of the challenge has been that, the idea that if you squeeze one woman in, then, she has responsibility. But I would argue that that's not enough. You have to actually look beyond that. And I think it's interesting, I was reading some sort of historical CEDAW committee reporting, and I noticed that early on, one of the, because Fiji obviously has Indigenous, Itukai and Indo-Fijians, and I think the CEDAW committee actually commented on the representation of the delegation from Fiji, as saying, in this case, the criticism was that it was all Indigenous Fijian women and no Indo-Fijian women represented. So I think those kinds of mechanisms where you build it in, the expectation is that you have the representatives of, all the groups, that women are not a homogenous group, and that you have to put particular mechanisms in place, I think, to make sure that the voices of those smaller groups that are critical but often unheard are built into those processes.
Thank you. And we've got a really good comment here, more of a comment from Dr. Rothschild. And he said, this is social ecology. It impacts on everyone, which, yeah, is actually a really good way to put it. Not just women, everyone is impacted.
Yeah, look, and I couldn't agree more. And I think for me, sometimes I bore myself going on and on about gender equality, but I think for me, this is the point. It's not about women. It actually benefits everybody. The work that I'm doing at the moment with ADB is about diversity in business leadership. And it actually shows that if you have more women on the boards, there's reams of research from around the world, companies perform better. So, you know, the impact of gender equality is that it benefits everybody. Communities are stronger, families are happier, economies are more prosperous. So yeah, I think I don't know why I still have a job. I really genuinely wish I didn't.
Yes. So that's a really good note to end on, that this is actually a much bigger issue. Gender inequality actually affects everybody, and it really affects the operation of our society and our planet and our world. And it's all about decision making, and also giving people access to less poverty and violence. So incredibly important. And I'd just like to thank you, Sarah, on behalf of the AIIA ACT branch and all the people that attended. It's just been the most wonderful, thought-provoking presentation, and really interesting. We'd actually love to get you back as a speaker. It's been fantastic, and we've only just scratched the surface on this important issue. So thank you so much. I think this issue has just highlighted so much in terms of a lot of the other problems we're facing, climate change, as well as problems with the Pacific and sovereignty as well. So thank you for your passionate advocacy on this and your work with the Asian Development Bank as well. And I think it's just been incredibly important tonight for our members to hear your presentation. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm always happy to talk about gender equality.